Tonight, playing politics with our national security. Why big donations are becoming a big distraction. And Russia keeps the world guessing, is Europe on the brink of war? Welcome to Q&A. That's a lovely welcome. Thank you very much. I'm Stan Grant, coming to you live from Sydney tonight. Let's take you through who's joining us on the panel. International relations expert Lavina, federal Liberal candidate for Gilmore, Andrew Constance, Allegra, who has been described as a Liberal blue blood but is now running as the independent candidate for Wentworth, Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Bowen, and joining us live from Melbourne, foreign editor at The Australian, Sheridan. Welcome them all. Great to have you here. We should point out that Liberal member for Wentworth, Dave Sharma, who Allegra is challenging, was initially planning to join us on the panel but later declined. And remember, you can stream us live on iView and our social channels. Quanda, as usual, is the hashtag. Please join in the conversation. We publish your comments on screen from all the socials. Let's go to our first question tonight. It comes from Magnus Cormac McManamy.
Thanks. Yesterday in Parliament under privilege, the Prime Minister described the Deputy Opposition Leader as the Manchurian candidate. How does the panel hold that in context against other cabinet ministers in the Liberal government, say for example, Andrew Robb, who was the then Trade Minister, who was responsible for the approval of the Darwin port and signed off on it, and then immediately afterwards left and took a job working for the Landbridge Company, a CCP associated company, and went off and took a job with them immediately after making that decision. Does it really matter that China is attempting to place candidates in our democratic process when sitting members of our Australian Parliament are so easily purchased?
Yeah, thanks for the question. A lot to that. Sheridan, I'll start with you.
Well, Stan, look, that's a great question. So I am very critical of Scott Morrison for uttering the words Manchurian candidate. They were absolutely wrong. He said them about Richard Marles. Richard Marles is a patriotic Australian. He doesn't serve any national interest other than Australia's. We ought to note that the Prime Minister immediately withdrew the comment. It was a stupid thing to say. Generally, this week, I think the government has substantially overdone its China rhetoric. And it's right to be critical of China, although I think the rhetoric is overdone. But it's wrong to say the Labor Party has been disloyal or un-Australian or not followed Australia's interests while it's in opposition. I give the Albanese opposition high marks. They supported AUKUS, they support nuclear-powered submarines. The opposition in the last term opposed the extradition treaty, which the Turnbull government was trying to ratify with the Chinese government. However, I think the government is perfectly entitled to subject Labor's actual record on national security to withering scrutiny. In its last term of government, Labor cut the defence budget to record lows. It said we desperately needed 12 regionally superior subs and then started ripping money out of defence and did nothing towards the subs. It had a catastrophic failure on border security. So that seems to me more than enough for the coalition to be going on with. I think making up these silly charges of, Labor serving someone else's national interest, I think that's wrong. I think it's unfair to the Labor Party, and I think it devalues the rhetoric of national security.
Bowen.
Well, thank you, Magnus. I've been in Parliament a while, and it's probably the grubbiest thing I have seen in Parliament. It was utterly disgraceful, inaccurate and appalling. And of course we face geopolitical challenges from China and Russia. But I'll tell you what our biggest asset as a country is. It's actually not our military hardware. It's actually not many things that you might think of. It's our national unity. The fact that we come together as one in the national interest. And the Labor Party has done that consistently. And to undermine that in Parliament is utterly appalling. Dennis Richardson, probably our most esteemed former diplomat, former head of ASIO, former ambassador to the United States, former head of Defence and DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs, said it was beyond grubby. And he's right. And it's also inaccurate. I mean, Andrew's here. Perhaps Andrew could explain to all of us what policy difference there is between the Labor Party and the government on China. Is it South China Sea? No. Is it Taiwan? No. Is it Hong Kong? No. Is it extradition treaty? No. We blocked the extradition treaty the Liberals wanted to put through. Is it Huawei? No. On every single strategic matter, the Labor Party has acted in the national interest. There has not been one policy difference. So it is utterly irresponsible, deeply reprehensible and entirely inaccurate. And frankly, it's desperado stuff from the government in the lead-up to the election. They are questioning people's patriotism as an act of political desperation.
I'll go to Andrew in that minute, but what about the substance? Greg raised some questions there about commitment to defence, supporting defence, defence spending, and given what you've outlined, and indeed you've been criticised by your former Prime Minister Paul Keating for being too in lockstep with the government when it comes to China, why would the Global Times, the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, say would prefer a Labor government?
Well, that article was actually written by an Australian, to be clear, and what they said about what they said about Scott Morrison was probably more complimentary than most of the text messages we've seen from his cabinet colleagues. So let's keep that in context. And in relation, we're happy to have a national security debate. I mean, this government's had 6 defence ministers in 8 years. They've had massive blowouts. They've had 3 attempts at a submarine deal. I mean, they've got 2 wrong, and now we're expected to believe that the 3rd one is the right one, all of a sudden, when they've had 3 goes. And one of the most challenging national security challenges for our country and our region is climate change. I mean, we live in the region most impacted by climate change in terms of impact on population. There are literally hundreds of millions of people in Indonesia who will have their homes inundated by rising sea levels. This is a national security challenge. We're putting aside even the Pacific. And they have no national security and climate change strategy, and we will. So I'm happy to have our records compared and our plans compared. Every Labor leader since 2013 has been committed to 2% of GDP being spent on defence. That's a bipartisan commitment. We can have a legitimate discussion and debate about national security.
It's probably going to require more than that, isn't it?
Well, but we can have a legitimate debate about all these things. But I'll tell you what we can't do and should not do. A legitimate debate about the patriotism of either side of politics. It's disgusting. That is not legitimate.
Let me just stay with you, though. If there's not a difference in policy or approach to China, is there a difference in the way that it's communicated or a difference in emphasis? I want to take you to what Penny Wong said last year when she was delivering her landmark speech on Australia's place in the world at the Australian National University. And she said, expressing who we are in narrow and exclusionary terms can inhibit potential for alignment, and it can diminish the cohesion in the Australian community. And she pointed this out. Recall Tony Abbott's championing of the Anglosphere and how that was perceived in the region. What's wrong with the Anglosphere, which has been the bedrock of Australian security since Australia for the last 200 years?
No, I'm familiar with that speech from Penny. It's a very good speech. And our view is you can do these things. We support AUKUS. We also support deeper...
But why criticise it publicly in a way that we know when China criticises America or Australia, it precisely talks about things like that?
Well, Stan, if I could make the point, we don't believe it's an either-or. You can support AUKUS and also support deeper engagement in the region. Our policy is to have a special envoy to ASEAN, for example, and to lift our level of engagement in ASEAN. The Southeast Asian region is where the geopolitical contest is actually going to be at its sharpest edge. We believe in deeper engagement. We believe AUKUS has a role. We believe the Quad has a role. We believe ASEAN has a role. We believe APEC, which is we take a lot of pride in the Labor Party, has a role as well. These are all important institutions. But as I said, what we don't do is divide. I mean, we've had a government senator, Senator Abetz, require Australians of Chinese heritage to affirm their loyalty to the country when they're giving evidence before a Senate committee. Didn't ask anybody else, didn't ask any Anglo-Celtic people. It was utterly disgusting. This is my point about division. We have a great asset in Australia, it's our unity. And part of that unity is bipartisanship, wherever possible, in the national interest. We've provided it. I mean, the government doesn't know how to take yes for an answer. I mean, we say yes to these things and they still, because they see a little potential focus group-driven political opportunity, they decide to question the patriotism of good Australians and they decide to rip up that unity. And it sends a terrible message to our allies, because one of the most important messages to our allies is governments can change, but important fundamentals are respected. There's an old saying that Labor Prime Ministers and Liberal Prime Ministers have good relationships with Democratic and Republican presidents, and it's true. But when a government says if the next election the government changes, it undermines that understanding of our allies. And I'll go back to my opening point. It is deeply, deeply irresponsible. And I would really like to hear what the matter of policy difference is between the government and the opposition on these matters, because frankly, there isn't one.
Andrew, Constance, why are we hearing this rhetoric? This, as Greg has said, using language like the Manchurian Candidate and how damaging that can be. Why are we seeing this tack?
Well, first of all, those words were withdrawn, and that's appropriate. This country needs to be very strong in its position, its language, its determination, its sovereignty, and we can't continue to see what we're seeing. We have an incredible engagement across the region. There is without doubt. But the coercive pressure that we are under and how that's going to play out on households to critical supplies, it wouldn't matter if it was fertiliser for farmers. We've seen the AdBlue issue. It is going to mean as a country we have to be very sensitive to our critical supplies and that engagement. We do not want to continue to see the coercive economic pressure that we are seeing. There is no doubt...
Politically, was this a mistake?
Beg your pardon?
Politically, was this a mistake, using that sort of language? And we've seen, we've seen the Chief of ASIO even coming out and warning against the dangers of using this type of language or intelligence in this way.
Well, certainly I think we should be listening to the experts in terms of ASIO. There's no ifs or buts in that regard. But what I would say, certainly, is there's no room for loose language. There should be no sanctions out of China on Australia in any form, and we should be firm on that. In terms of what we're seeing in Europe at this point, I mean, to think that the Ukraine had a National Unity Day yesterday, which we should have all stood so firmly as a world, looking at those young people saying, we're looking to the West, we're not looking to the East, and the old-style USSR.
I'll get you to hold that thought, because we are going to come to the question of Russia in a minute. Can I just come back to you, Magnus, on that? And you had your hand up, so you obviously want to respond in some way. But the second part of your question as well, when it came to Andrew Robb, I want to point out as well, it was the Northern Territory government that signed off on that deal when it came to the ports. And Andrew Robb, of course, no longer works in that position. But what are your concerns there about former politicians working for Chinese companies, potential influence and interference? And what about what you've heard here tonight?
To the first part? I think there's definitely, and most Australians would say this, I think, there's definitely a problem in the political system around politicians being able to take advisory and lobbying roles after they leave Parliament. This is a massive issue. And I think the other thing I really just wanted to say, I think when you were asking about the language of the Manchurian Candidate, I think when you look at the context of that statement, but also a Prime Minister who held up a piece of coal in federal parliament when there's a rule around no props. The only thing that shows greater disrespect for the democracy and the parliamentary process is the fact that he scheduled so few parliamentary days.
Well, as Tony Jones would have said, I'll take that as a comment, but we are going to come back to the question of coal in a minute, Allegra. Yeah.
And I wanted to make thank you for raising that point, and that point about integrity and the revolving door of politics, because I think that's certainly something that I've heard from the people of Wentworth, is this concern about how politicians are not holding up themselves to the standards that the community expects. The community expects politicians, when they're in Parliament and also after in Parliament, to always be acting in the interests of the Australian people and not to be acting in their personal interests or the interests of the party, because that is what they are in government to do. And I think that is certainly an expectation. And I think there are many other aspects in terms of integrity, which I'm sure we're going to get to sometime in the program, that we will be addressing. But I think this is multifaceted, that we should be considering about transparency in who they're meeting, in terms of revolving door after they leave, and also what are the processes for people to be appointed to government boards. Because again, this politicisation of the fundamental tools of Australians' governance is not what people want to see, and it's not expected by the community.
And of course, we're talking about Andrew Robb, the former Trade Minister. We could equally mention Sam Dastyari and, of course, where that ended up for him. But Lavina, just to bring it back to this question about, and this is going to be a theme in the election. We live in times when China hovers over Australia, and it's unavoidable. And the questions of security, Greg raised questions about defence spending, questions of security are going to be front and centre.
Yeah.
When you look and you spend your time analysing this, you look at the respective merits of the two major parties seeking to form government, who is the better bet for national security?
Right. No
pressure.
This is the business you're in, Lavina.
Look, I think it's the question was about politicisation of China policy, and I think the government has a lot to be proud of in terms of really taking quite world-leading positions on standing up to China. There are a line of European countries coming to Australia to talk to Australian politicians, policymakers, to say, how do we do this? How do we follow your model? So I really think that the government didn't really need to go down this path. It already has a strong position to sell to the electorate. And I think there's a danger in effectively making the population maybe a little bit cynical about why they did it in the first place. And that's a real problem with politicising the matter, is that people start to wonder, did you do it for the national interest or did you do it for some other political interest? I think in terms of the Labor Party, I think Chris Bowen's correct in saying, and Greg for that matter, that there has been a real strong level of bipartisanship, and that's been a real boon for Australia to have that bipartisanship. But I do think when it comes to the substance, the quote that you raised from Penny Wong's speech about the Anglosphere, for example, I think there are some doubts about whether Labor would have a stronger resolve. And that's not to say that Labor can't dispel those doubts, but I think when you have elder statesmen in the party like Paul Keating or Bob Carr for that matter, who put forward some quite softer positions, sometimes you might even say a bit defeatist about China, I think that the current leadership, the current Labor Party probably needs to come out more strongly and refute those positions, not merely say that they disagree with them.
I think they probably were, and I don't know that Bob Carr and Paul Keating would describe it as defeatist, but we'll move on. We did mention that we were going to talk about Russia and Ukraine. Of course, it's front and centre right now with more than 100,000 Russian troops on the Ukraine border. So we'll go to our next question. It comes from Lai Ha Chan.
Hi, thanks for having me. So my question is about international relations, as you say, the Ukraine and Russian crisis. So currently, the world is focusing on this crisis. And I'm just wondering, what are the geopolitical implications for the Asia-Pacific region, depending on the path that Russia takes?
Thank you for that. Greg, I'll bring you back in on this because, of course, we did also see during the Olympic Games the signing of what's being called this No Limits Pact, or a new form of alliance, if that's not too strong a word, between China and Russia. What are the implications? Ukraine may seem like a long way away. Australia has already lost people as a result of the conflict. Remember the downing of the Malaysian Airlines plane. But what are the reverberations for our region?
Well, Stan, and I really appreciate the question, the connection now between everything on the globe is very intense. So the Biden administration made a debacle of the way it withdrew from Afghanistan. That diminished its sense of competence, its aura of consequence in the world. No one is watching what happens in Ukraine more closely than China. So there are different ways that Ukraine can affect what happens in Taiwan. Of course, Ukraine is tremendously important in its own sake. 44 million people, they deserve not to be assaulted by Russia, not to have their sovereignty trampled on. But in terms of the outcome for the Asia-Pacific, if Putin just manages to keep a sense of crisis in Ukraine all the time, he will hope to divide NATO and draw America into sending a lot of resources to Europe, which are resources that he takes away from the Indo-Pacific. Already, it's an open question whether, in conventional terms, the United States could deal with a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I don't think there's a simple one-to-one relationship that if the Russians invade Ukraine, the Chinese will think that's good timing and they'll invade Taiwan. But if the Americans react without consequence, or the Europeans are divided from the Americans, and we've got to, recognise incredible European weakness here. Western Europe is much bigger and much richer than Russia, but it can do nothing against Russia unless America does it for it. this will affect the way China views its prospects in Taiwan. And just as Putin has many, many options in Ukraine, from cyber, through limited territorial acquisition, through missile strikes, through disinformation campaigns, all the way up to invasion, so Beijing has many, many options in Taiwan, from cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, grey zone activities, maybe taking one outlying island first, perhaps blockading Taiwan as Russia might blockade Odessa. And if the West fails in Ukraine, that will not only be a tragedy in itself, but I think it increases the likelihood of Beijing doing something military and kinetic and violent and terrible in Taiwan.
Lavina, both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have expressed a view that they believe that the West is weakening, is waning. They point to things like the American withdrawal from Afghanistan and the return of the Taliban as evidence of this. It is a question, as Greg says, isn't it, of American resolve, and particularly for Australian security, that resolve is absolutely essential. How do you assess that at the moment, vis-a-vis China and Russia and the potential for some form of military action in Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it is, as Greg said, it is a litmus test of the resolve of the United States and its allies and partners. Are they willing to expend blood and treasure defending values, defending small states against authoritarian nations that trample on sovereignty?
Joe Biden has said very explicitly he's not going to put American troops in Ukraine.
And there is a question about that. So they seem to be, ratcheting up their deterrent capabilities. So they are trying to make it as unpalatable as possible to effectively deter Russia from actually crossing that line. But it seems as though they're spending more efforts to make an invasion more difficult as opposed to stopping the invasion in the first place. So yes, there are, the military action is off the table. I think they haven't probably armed Ukraine sufficiently. I think they could do more. They are threatening quite legitimately, I think, that they are going to put quite serious financial, technological sanctions on Russia, which should make him think somewhat twice about whether it's worth it. Things like denying Russian entities, and not just small entities. So Russia has been under sanctions since it took Crimea. But now we're talking about including large Russian entities and stopping them from getting access to the American dollar. So that will have quite major implications for Russian entities and any other country that wants to do business with Russia, including Chinese entities, will also be subject to effectively secondary sanctions.
Allegra Spender, you're seeking to enter Parliament at a time when we are really at a bit of a hinge point. And Greg's talked about that, and Lavina's laid out what the risks are here and the risks for the region. For someone like Vladimir Putin, who's weighing up the cost of sanctions versus achieving his aims in bringing Ukraine back under his sphere of influence and stopping it entering NATO, what are the options for countries like Australia, middle power countries, in being able to influence, bring some influence to bear in situations like this?
Look, I think Australia needs to work with its allies, and I think that is absolutely appropriate, and it needs to work in conjunction with the different groups that Australia is part of, and look at the economic sanctions, which are certainly the things that we would expect to see Australia to participate in relation to Europe. And I think then Australia also needs to consider, I think, the point that was raised about what this means in terms of China's relationship in our area, because that is going to be something that is of greatest importance to that.
Can I just ask you, though, there is a cost to be paid here, and Australia has paid a cost already from standing up to China, a real cost to our economy. We know that there have been trade bans placed on various products. There's a deep freeze. Australia doesn't speak to China, or China doesn't speak to Australia. So how do we navigate that, knowing that there is going to be a cost, sometimes a cost even greater for countries like us than, say, the United States may pay?
Look, I think that, I guess two things on this. One is that, we have paid, I think, a high price, for what we've done with China, and I think what we've done with China is completely appropriate. That said, I think we have missed the opportunity to continue to have ministerial relationships and to have some back channels open with China, which I think could be helpful in terms of maintaining.
If they won't speak to us, what
No, well, I think, but that is about the quality of the relationship that we foster as well. And so I think those are real questions, and I think we need to make sure that we are using our diplomacy appropriately in that situation. And then I think, I know there are always costs, but I think we should also look at what are the opportunities and also what are the lessons from this. And I look at Russia, what is going on in Russia, and I say, look, one of the reasons why Europe finds it difficult to deal with Russia is because of the dependence on gas and energy. And I think that actually brings us back to what Australia's opportunity is in its world, in being a really opportunity in terms of a clean energy superpower and actually playing a really positive role in terms of being an export that the rest of the world can depend on. And it also reflects in terms of what we should be thinking about our own energy security and our own reliance on foreign oil.
Let's stay with this subject because there are more questions to be asked about this moment and what the potential invasion of Ukraine may mean. Our next question is a video from Adil Carter.
Some see the recent advancements around the world as a challenge to the notion of American unipolar global power, characterized by unchallenged US economic and military predominance. Russia is continuing with military advancements in Ukraine, with the US unchallenging them. There are also security threats to balance in Asia as well. Does all this confirm a new global power shift?
Are we facing a new global power shift, Chris Bowen? Joe Biden has said this era is marked by democracy and its capacity to withstand the challenge of authoritarianism. Given China's rise in the world, is authoritarianism gaining momentum?
Yes. And not just China, as big a challenge that is, but you can look around the world at the rise of authoritarian governments in certain regimes, and that is a challenge, and it's one that's emerged over the last 5 to 10 years. In all these things, Adil, in Australia, we have to be guided by two things: our values and our interests. And in this case, our values and our interests align very neatly. Our values would say that a big, powerful country like Russia should not be invading a country like Ukraine. That is an affront to our values as a nation. And our interests are a calm, stable international order. That is the very opposite of a calm, stable international order is what we're seeing play out between Russia and Ukraine at the moment, and potentially, and we hope that it de-escalates, and it may de-escalate, but potentially see that play out. And then to the previous question, obviously, that instability may be then dealt with by other actors, capitalising on that instability. So that is an affront to both our values and an affront to our interests. Now, the question has been done, what can Australia do about it? Well, look, we should stand for our values. We should stand with Ukraine, and we should communicate our view very clearly to Ukraine and to the world. We should certainly consider participating in sanctions. I mean, we're a very small trading partner of Russia. We shouldn't overstate, the impact of anything we do. But it's important we stand with our friends and our allies and our like-minded countries in a situation like this and stand for those two things: our interests and our values.
More than that is required, though, isn't it? Because at this moment, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are prepared to seize the initiative. Putin has already annexed Crimea, and he was prepared to wear the impact of sanctions. He invaded Georgia. He's intervened in Syria, propping up the Assad regime. Xi Jinping has said very explicitly that he reserves the right to take Taiwan by force. So these are not hypothetical questions. Under a Labor government, if indeed there was some action, and some in the US have speculated that there could be a move on Taiwan within the next 6 years, under a Labor government, would there be a commitment that you would actually commit troops to defending a state like Taiwan that we don't recognise as a sovereign nation?
Stan, it would be deeply irresponsible of me, frankly. I understand why you would ask the question, but it would be deeply irresponsible of me as an alternative cabinet minister to start second-guessing hypotheticals like that. Peter Dutton said it would be inconceivable that we wouldn't enter a war. I think that was irresponsible of the Defence Minister. There's a long tradition on both sides of politics in Australia of not engaging in that sort of speculation because it's deeply unhelpful. If a situation like that arises, the government of the day should engage with the best advice of all its experts. It should consult with like-minded countries, not just our intelligence partners around the world, but countries in our region. We should act very carefully based on the best advice. But it would be, frankly, irresponsible of me to say, oh, yes, we would or yes, we wouldn't. That is not how these things should work. I understand people might, have a view and an interest, but in the national interest, government ministers shouldn't engage in that speculation and alternative ministers should not engage in that speculation.
Andrew, Constance, you want to say something in response to...
Well, I mean, look, I think that the most important step we've taken forward is AUKUS in this current climate, in this environment. Coming back to the Russia question, I think it's a really important question as to how influential countries like Germany can be at this time, given that Putin obviously has a concern about NATO and the advancement of NATO over the last 2 decades. But the other thing is that as a global environment, to Chris's point, and I agree, we have to be firm. If the channels are broken down by China, as they have been, and those bureaucratic discussion points can't happen, we have that alliance, and it is possibly the greatest hallmark of this government, the greatest achievement in that regard. There is no doubt that liberal democracies around the world combined to deal with the authoritarianism of both the President of China and the President of Russia, who, if you go and examine their histories and their backgrounds, very different, but nonetheless, their formative years were informed by years gone by, decades gone by.
And the Cold War.
The Cultural Revolution. And there is no doubt, we have to be mindful of these territory advancements and how they can be de-escalated quickly, because there will be a humanitarian crisis. If Ukraine is invaded, and to see what we saw yesterday with young people who could be easily in our country, not wanting this to happen. And I'm pretty sure there's young people in Russia who share those same values that a lot of liberal democracies around the world hold dear. So I think we do need to be firm, and we do need to be firm with our allies.
Stan, can I enter a footnote there?
Yeah.
It might be irresponsible to say we'd go to war if Taiwan was attacked, but it's also the truth. And Australians ought to understand, if there is a China-US war over Taiwan, we won't have a choice. For a start, Pine Gap and the Northwest Cape are critical US communications facilities. If China is trying to blind the United States from the ability to see missile launches and communicate with its submarines, it will attack us right out of the gates. We'll be target number one. Secondly, if we don't come to the defence of a liberal democracy of 25 million people when our ally is fighting and dying to preserve that, then our alliance is finished. So it's inconceivable to me that any Australian government would say no. Thirdly, our trade with China stops on the first day of the war. No more iron ore exports, no more coal exports, nothing else. So our economy screams to a shuddering halt. Now, all that means we have an interest in having the most credible deterrence we can to stop this from happening. But we should know, if it happens, it won't be like Iraq, it won't even be like Ukraine, a long way away from us. It will transform our national existence in every aspect.
Let's go to our next question now, and it comes from Asefa Bakili.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. My question is to all the panels. Any person who is super intelligent and greatly helpful to the society cannot get elected unless he or she is super rich or supported by super rich people. This is the reality of politics today. I am afraid that this cannot be called democracy. What do members of the panel say about this?
Allegra, you're rich. Does it make it easier to get into Parliament?
I thought this was coming to me. Look, I think that, the Australian Parliament needs to be a place which is represented by a broad range of people, and in terms of gender, in terms of background, and in terms of in terms of ethnicity, and more broadly, what the great qualities of the Australian country. And I think that that's important to absolutely all of us. And I think then you look at the Parliament and say, look, how do we make sure that this is truly accessible to everybody who wants to participate? And I think I come back to actually some of the, a bit of the questions that we raised at the start in terms of integrity, in terms of what is the options for people to get involved in politics, and you can certainly get involved, through the parties. But I think, political donations are really an issue in this country, and it's something that we should absolutely reform. And I absolutely invite the Liberal government, who's in power at the moment, to consider what donation reforms it could undertake to make sure that many people can really participate in that democracy. Well, that said, I'd like to add something else, is to say, I don't have a full socioeconomic background of everybody in Parliament, but I don't believe that everybody in Parliament is from a super wealthy background, and I think it's really important to make sure that people are encouraged.
Chris is sitting next to you. I think Chris would.
Not rich or super rich, no.
So I think that it's really important to say that there are options open. So I think I've got a more positive view than perhaps than you shared there.
Let me just come back on the question of donations in a minute, but it is an interesting question, Chris, because there's a time, days gone by, when you'd have train drivers and shearers in Parliament, and it's become incredibly professionalised. People are either lawyers or doctors or business people, or they've worked their way through the political system. To come from the working class or to have a trade and end up in Parliament is still quite rare, isn't it now?
There has been, Stan, a societal shift as well. You don't have to be rich or super rich to be in Parliament. But to your point, Stan, my dad was a shift worker at the NRMA. My mum was a childcare worker. We grew up at a fibre house in Smithfield, the suburb I still live in. And that's quite a common story in federal parliament, in parliaments. I'm the first in my family to go to university, and that would be a very common story, certainly on the Labor side, that we are the first generation of the sons of and daughters of tradespeople and shift workers who had the chance to go to university. My parents were smart enough to go to university, but they wouldn't have dreamt of it. Same with my grandparents, my great-grandparents, etc. So that's that shift, which, again, we're proud of in the Labor Party, because we think we played a role in that, in the opening up of universities and the lifting of the school retention rates in the 80s and 90s up to 90%. It was 30% in 1983 of kids who finished Year 12. By the time we left office in 1996, it was 90%. And a lot of those kids went on to university. Now, you don't forget that. I don't forget my dad coming home at 7 o'clock in the morning from shift work. I don't forget my mum looking after five kids, to get, to support the family. You don't forget that. Yes, we managed to get to university, and that's a wonderful thing. But there is a role. There should be a place for everyone in Parliament. And I guess we'll come to the question about donations and money and all that sort of stuff.
That is the question. And you may not have to be rich, but you need rich backing. It takes money to get there. And I want to go to what we've seen over the past week, Allegra, and we've seen Zali Steggall and conceding of failing to disclose a $100,000 donation from the family trust of a wealthy business person who'd had coal investments. So accused of hypocrisy in many respects there, taking money from coal and also not disclosing it. And the person who was blamed for this, her financial controller, Damien Hodgkinson, is apparently yours as well. Is that the case?
So Damien Hodgkinson has been my accountant, yes. And I think, because I'm new to running campaign, and so I'm trying to work with people who know how to make their declarations appropriately. And
are you confident in him, given what we've seen this past week?
Look,
and Zali Steggall says that he's the person to blame for this.
I'm paying an absolute great deal of attention to this, because I think those questions are really important. But I actually think there's another option here, and I think that you see it with someone like Cathy McGowan, with how she built her political career, because she wasn't rich and she wasn't really backed by really rich people, but she actually got her community together and said, what is important to you? And she listened to that, and through that built. And she actually built a grassroots movement that enabled her entire community to say, look, we want to change, a very safe seat to achieve something where our community feels truly, truly represented. So I think that there are a couple of different ways to get there, but one of them is actually mobilising your community, because some of the most impactful things that you can do in this election and more broadly is get organised just with people. Some of the most effective parts of what we're doing is actually just getting people together and saying, what's important to you, and put on a T-shirt and get out and about. So those are really important places to start, and there are options there.
Are you just on Damien Hodgkinson? He's going to remain as your financial controller, advisor?
We are looking at all options in terms of how to make sure that everything is done absolutely effectively, because this is a very serious issue.
So perhaps he won't?
I'm just making sure that I do the right, I have the right returns and everything from that point of view. So I want to make sure I'm going through this everything with a really fine-tooth comb, and if there are any concerns, then he won't, or if he would like to move on otherwise.
Andrew?
Oh, look, I think politics without ideology in Australia is dead. This election needs to be a positive experience for our community, and that means ensuring that the community is front and centre in the campaign. We're all tired, we're all exhausted, we've all had enough of the pandemic. My community's been belted by a whole heap of things. You know, we can humanise climate change and the pressures there. If you do not have the ideology there, you start to strip away the potential foundations of your liberal democracy. One thing I would say at the moment is that there is a real disconnect and people are disengaged with politics in Australia. They've had enough. The partisan nature of it, it's making people tired. My most successful time in state politics was when I was Disability Services Minister. The person I worked with most closely was Jenny Macklin on the NDIS. And that was possibly the biggest social reform the country's had in decades. And it was bipartisan. So I think it's really important that the parliaments do reflect Australia. You know, ultimately at the moment, there is a question around the independent movement, and obviously it's an issue for the Libs. One thing I would say is that, you know, to be truly independent, ultimately there does need to be that openness and transparency around who's you're backing. And if there's one backer across numerous independents, that's not an independent movement, that's a political movement. And
can you just hold the thought, because we are
sure.
going to come back to you in just a moment, because we're staying with this question of independence and what that means and what the independent movement represents. Let's go to this question from Harry Chine.
Is that me?
Harry?
Yep.
Yeah.
Dave Sharma crossed the floor on Thursday morning to vote for amendments to the government's flawed Religious Discrimination Act. In doing so, Dave showed courage and strength of character to the people of Wentworth. The next election will be fought on trust. Allegra Spender, why should the people of Wentworth vote for you when Dave Sharma has shown he has integrity on issues that matter to him?
Well, one of the questions I think people are asking for, and thank you so much for that, Harry, is if indeed it comes down to a hung parliament, independents are going to be important and you do get elected, who do you side with? Who do you guarantee for supply?
So what I am trying to do is stand for what is important to the people of Wentworth. And I've spent a lot of time since I've started this campaign and before then is actually really listening and starting to saying what is important to you and what are you seeking from your representative. And I think absolutely they're seeking action on climate change, because I think Wentworth is a very business-focused electorate and it sees that there's a huge economic opportunity there. They also see the environmental imperative on that. They want to focus on cleaner politics. They are sick of the politicisation. I think, you know, Andrew, your point is absolutely right. People are exhausted and they're not interested in sort of, you know, political name-calling. They want, you know, they want...
But they do want answers, and you're not answering that question.
I am, sorry, I'm coming
fundamentally, who would you support if it came down to it?
I'm going to say, I'm actually getting there, Stan, which is to say my job is to support what's important to Wentworth. And the other key issue for Wentworth is it's a very business-focused electorate. And I think that the other question is, like, how are the parties really focused on the long-term economics, you know, prosperity of Australia? Those are very important questions to the people of Wentworth. So for me, what I will be doing if we come to a hung parliament is saying, look, what is the situation and how, you know, what are the opportunities to actually stand for the people of Wentworth? And the other other thing I'll be doing, regardless of who is in power, is voting on what is important to the communities of Wentworth. So, for instance, you know, in the question of the Religious Discrimination Bill, which I think is a really important one, you know, I consulted with faith leaders in Wentworth, and I also consulted with LGBTQI leaders in Wentworth to understand what's important. And I applaud Dave for taking that stance, but on the other side is he hasn't done that on other issues that are really important to the electorate.
Okay, well, he was going to be here tonight to answer that.
I know, well, I'm sad he isn't.
But can we just... I want to bring Greg Sheridan in here. Greg, there are a lot of independents running now, and there is this movement, and well-funded. Do we need to know where independents stand and where their votes are going to be and which parties they would support or which party they would support in the event that vote is going to determine who forms government?
Yeah, I think we do, Stan. So, you know, I greatly admire Allegra and she speaks so well and so on, but she wouldn't answer your question. And all these independents who all have the same ideology, the same financial backer, whose policies are so similar to the Labor Party, why won't they say honestly, OK, I know what all the Liberal Party policies are, I know what all the Labor Party policies are. If it comes down to a hung parliament, I'm inclined to back Anthony Albanese to be Prime Minister, or I'm inclined to back Scott Morrison. And if they simply point blank refuse to say that, and, you know, this splendid program is the first time I've heard them under proper scrutiny on this issue, then that really hurts Westminster democracy. Because in Westminster democracy, parties go to an election with a thought-out platform which embodies lots of compromises, and you choose one side or the other with all of its inherent compromises. In other sorts of democracies, you elect a cacophony of wild people with clandestine agendas who then decide after the election who they're going to make Prime Minister. And I think independents, if they want to be taken seriously, ought to tell us. So Allegra must know which set of policies she prefers between Anthony Albanese and Scott Morrison. And if she won't say that, that's not really being fair to the electors.
Mm-hmm. I have a few comments on that, Greg. Firstly, I think the Labor is making itself a very small target, so frankly it's a little bit unclear what they are actually standing for this election, and we are still unclear on a number of the policies of the government at the same time. But, you know, I'm not seeking as an independent to be part of a government. I am seeking to really contribute to the Parliament. And so I'm not going to say in advance I'm not going to say in advance who I'm going to support, because I actually don't know who I'm going to support.
But you don't think the people of Wentworth deserve to know that?
No, I think they need to know what I stand for. And so I think that's really important to the people of Wentworth to say, you know, they need to, you know, to have confidence in me that I'm going to stand for what is important to the people of Wentworth, and I'm absolutely going to do that, because that's what they're seeking at the moment. That's what they're not getting, because the policies that are inclined, you know, Scott Morrison and Barnaby Joyce's policies in relation to things like climate are completely at odds with the people of Wentworth, and that's the problem.
Well, OK, we're going to come to climate in just a moment anyway. But Lavina, Greg used the word cacophony. One of the things that we are seeing, and Andrew's talked about a loss of faith in politics, and we saw this week another report saying people are losing faith in institutions, and there's been a drift away from the two major parties, and primary vote is down for the two major parties. So what do we end up with in a parliament peopled by more independents? Is that more representative of democracy? Is it the cacophony? Does it become unwieldy? How do you see this?
Look, I think it's not long ago that we had, say, the Gillard government had a minority government. There's been recent periods in our history where Parliament did become very chaotic. It was very difficult to know whether the government's mandate could actually be achieved. So I do think that is actually a danger with too many independents, that there is the mandate of the government cannot be fulfilled, and it's held up. And I think actually as voters, I'm a voter too, you do get quite frustrated. And I think, say, the last 2 years, politics has been dominated by coronavirus and reacting from a week-to-week, month-to-month reaction to coronavirus. It's like a crisis. We're getting to the point now where in the post-pandemic period because of our vaccination rates. And I think this is why this election is so important, because we want to get back on track. We want to see that governments actually do things, they reform things, they can actually pass legislation in Parliament and get things done.
Sorry, Allegra, I just want to, before we move on, I want to come back to Chris, because in terms of getting things done and reform, part of the question related to religious discrimination, you said at the end of the last election, and indeed you paid a cost in your own electorate with a swing against you, and you warned that Labor is losing the religious. Is that still the case? Because after last week, the fact is that in New South Wales, as the law stands, someone, a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf or a Christian person can be discriminated against, lose their job as a result of their faith. Do they still hold that against you?
I want to deal with that statement. I also just want to answer Harry's question briefly too. There's been a lot discussed. There's a lot to unpack. Firstly, Harry, you're right. I respect the fact, as Allegra does, that Dave Sharp crossed the floor, but he didn't achieve anything. I mean, it was a promise the Liberal government made in the Wentworth by-election to ensure no discrimination against kids in schools. That promise was made now 4 years ago. He voted for that, so, you know, that was the least he could do. And then his own government withdrew the legislation. So it is currently legal to discriminate against kids. So they say you have to have a member of the government to be effective. That's not true. That has been ineffective. Secondly, in relation to religious discrimination, yes, we should have a religious discrimination law in Australia. I know that's not a universally popular view, but it is the case. It's currently illegal under federal law to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their age, their race, their sex. It is not illegal.
But it doesn't end there, does it? It's also about people's speech and the right to actually express your faith as robustly as you like, according to that faith. And just to bring it back to that question about Labor, and are you still losing the religious
I believe
it's going to hurt you in the West?
I believe, Stan, there's a lot of cynicism in the communities of faith about how the government has handled this. They were promised...
And Labor?
No, in the way the government has handled it. Scott Morrison made a promise. Before the last election, there will be a religious freedom bill, he called it, turned into a religious discrimination bill. No quibble with that. He hasn't delivered it. He waited till 2 minutes to midnight. Wait a minute, Stan,
the clock's winding down, and I did ask you that question about, but you've pointed out that Labor is losing people of faith, and the question is simply that: are you still losing? You're not.
No, my belief is no, because the government's behaviour has been very cynical. Labor supported the religious discrimination bill because we don't believe religious discrimination is appropriate in Australia in 2022. It should not be okay to discriminate against somebody for their faith or lack of faith. It is not okay. It should be illegal. Also, we believe in protections. It should not be okay to discriminate against kids in schools. We believe both of those things are achievable. That's what the amendments we moved achieved. And we voted for a religious discrimination bill because we think you can do both, and a Labor government will do both.
OK, we only got about 10 minutes left, so I want to get to our next question. It comes from Abby Dawson.
We just passed the 2-year anniversary of the Black Summer bushfires. Whilst members of the government like David Coleman and Greg Hunt have been doing a great job in addressing mental health challenges, what are you offering in terms of assistance in the area of mental health and recovery to the people of Gilmore?
Abby, before we go to the panel, tell me about your own experience, because you were evacuated, you had friends who were directly affected as well. What was it like for you?
It haunts you every day. Like, wherever you look, you see the bushfires coming over the hill of Mount Dromedary, Gulliga, what it's known as. It's just the amount of support that we still need after these bushfires is horrendous. It needs so much more, and COVID kind of overshadowed that. So since COVID is going into the background, we need more emphasis on what happened with that bushfire.
And is there a lot of... Just before I come to Andrew on it, is there a lot of anger, and where is that anger directed?
I wouldn't say there would be anger now, because we've seen COVID had been the big thing because it was a national-wide issue. Of course, it had to be the big thing. But now we've still got people in temporary housing that still need that mental health support. And especially in the community of Cobargo, the lives that were lost there still haunt everyone every day. So,
Andrew, Constance, we saw some of the anger on the weekend, didn't we? And Liberals got thumped in a by-election in Bega, and you'd been out campaigning in your old seat. And how much of the responsibility do you bear for what we're still hearing here from Abby?
Well, Stan, I'll be honest with you. I'll level with you. I got diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder after that event. I've had it before with head-on car accident, but not like this. And I got treatment in Sydney because I could. There's thousands of Australians tonight who having to relive triggers in relation to fire, and I'd urge everybody on both sides of politics as we head into the election campaign around fire recovery, be mindful of what triggers can be brought to bear. You know, every individual is different. Every pathway through this recovery is different. I saw some good figures in terms of DAs that have been approved through the Indo-Pacific Shire, where there was over 500 homes lost. We're getting up close to 300 DAs been approved. There is a lack of builders. But to Abby's point, I mean, you know, one of the reasons I'm running for federal parliament is the way the country is dealing with mental health and wellness. It's not there. I mean, we were the human face of climate change, but also bad land management practices. And, you know, ultimately there's a myriad of reasons to why these events occurred like they did. And I never, ever, ever want to see another firestorm, particularly being in the middle of it at 8 o'clock in the morning. These things are, you know, they're inexplicable. You know, ultimately now what we are seeing is a lot of people who are underinsured. If there's any anger that I hold about this issue at the moment, we have seen progressively planning law requirements change and the level of insurance premiums not match those changes, and that's why people are now still living in temporary accommodation on their blocks. And we've got to lift. We all have to lift. We were unified in you know, the disaster. We were unified in recovery. We got belted by the pandemic. So, you know, I think ultimately, having stood on a fire-affected property the other day, we've got to be mindful that each individual is different. A lot of people have been able to move on and recover very well, and there is this good sense of community spirit. But, you know, we've got a long way to go.
Sorry to hear about the PTSD, and I hope it...
I'm happy to be open about it.
And I'm sorry to hear about the trauma that you're going through, Abby, as well. But there is a political side to this, and you are standing for politics. And we did see the result in Bega, and we saw the response to Scott Morrison during the fires, and I think you said he got the response that he deserved. Are you going to be asking for Scott Morrison to stand with you and campaign with you when you seek to win the seat of Gilmore?
Yeah, I mean, look, the bottom line is, in my private discussions with the PM, he gets that, and he understands it. I think he learned from that experience that so many Australians have been through. And he would expect me to stand up and be strong for my community. That's what politics is all about. But one thing I would observe is, particularly at this point in time, we're at a critical juncture in terms of the recovery because we're coming out of the pandemic, which has caused enormous suffering. I do think that ultimately, I can give you an example. There are things that need to change right now. We still need, you know, telehealth to be bulk billed in terms of psychiatric support for people. I mean, I was able to get that support and I'm well. But it leaves an indelible, lifelong scar. And so ultimately, in terms of the by-election on the weekend, it's a myriad of issues. There was a hospital at Maruya that was an issue. We had a very high-profile Labor Party candidate in Dr. Holland, who I've worked with closely over the years. And I think there is this localisation about politics, which is really important for the community. And, you know, ultimately that's part of why we have to be very sensitive to what people are experiencing at this time.
But you'd acknowledge it's, you know, you face an uphill task. In Gilmore, you've got 2% or so swing.
2.5% Labor seat. But at the end of the day, this is about my community and my country in that sense. And we are going to see more fire events very soon because of the very nature in which the cycles are changing.
Thank you for your question, Abby. And if this discussion also raises any issues for you, the numbers for Lifeline and Beyond Blue are on your screen. Next week, Q&A is going to continue this conversation with the program special on anxiety and mental health as well. To finish tonight, our next question comes from Annette Guerry.
I'd like to ask the panel, what do you think is motivating women at this particular time to not only go stand for government, but specifically to stand as independent candidates?
Well, I suppose it'll have to go to Allegra.
Look, I think there's a lot of frustration in the community, and certainly as a woman, I would like to see the Parliament reflect the community that we're in, and it doesn't reflect it from a gender point of view. It doesn't reflect from an ethnicity point of view, and it doesn't reflect from actually the point that you raised earlier in terms of the different jobs and different profiles that people come from. And so, for me, I'm standing because partly I looked at the statistics of women in particularly the coalition in the lower house, and I found that in 1996 there were 23% women in the lower house, and in 2019 there were 22% women in the lower house. And I think that when you look at what's happened in the last 3 years in relation to Brittany Higgins and the various scandals that have been beset and the Jenkins review of parliamentary culture, what you see is that you need to change the culture, and I think the way to change the culture is to start by the leadership, and that was certainly one of the key recommendations. So that is a factor certainly for me.
Chris Bowen, when it comes to changing the culture, there's been a bit of pox on both houses, hasn't there? We heard from Nicole Flint just this week saying that, the abuse she got from the left side of politics.
Well, Nicole's got strong views about that, and I respect the fact she's leaving Parliament and she's expressed those views. But, we have a caucus full of very vocal and strong leading women, in our leadership group, in our shadow cabinet, and, you can't say the same about the government, to be fair. I think in relation to independence, let me be very clear. I advocate a vote for the Labor Party. I'll be campaigning for Tim Murray in the Labor Party, with all due respect to Allegra. I do recognise, given we haven't come close to Wentworth since 1943 when Jessie Street was our candidate, we're the underdog. But I believe in it. You change the government, you change the country. And this country is desperate for a change. And we desperately need a Labor government to fix climate change and have...
I did ask what women want, and we've got a stump speech about
well,
what Labor want to deliver.
The question went to an important point, which I'm answering from my point of view as a panellist, because I believe in a change of government, and I respect the role that independents will play, and there'll be a strong contest in seats like Wentworth where we would be the underdog. I think the independence movement reflects a few things: frustration of 20 years of delay and denial by the coalition on climate change, for example. You can be a Conservative and believe in action on climate change, and I think there's deep frustration that the right-wing rump of the Liberal and National Party has vetoed any real action on climate change for the last 15 to 20 years. I believe there's deep frustration that the Liberal Party promised a federal ICAC 4 years ago and has done bugger all about it. Deep frustration.
There'll be another opportunity. We are almost out of time.
Things that will change that are a change of government.
On us, Chris. We do want to get to everybody before we go. Just quickly, Andrew.
Look, I think it's interesting. We had a debate about religious freedom last week. We need one national discrimination bill in this country, not multiple, because I think there is an ability, as we have seen, for Australians to be left shaking their head after, the argy-bargy in the Parliament. There is no doubt, if you look at what's required, the culture within Parliament does need to change. The hours, the very nature of it and its function is just not geared properly. There is sensible reforms that you can undertake, and it does require bipartisanship to do it. I think more broadly across our community, there has to be a zero tolerance to this issue. It is not good enough. And, to that point, our workplaces, our parliaments, have not been up to the level that they should have been. Country has generated 1.7 million jobs in the last few years. 1 million of those jobs are women, which is very encouraging. But there is a long way to go in terms of some of the gender discrimination that we're seeing, and that needs to be stamped out.
Lavina, I don't know whether politics is something that interests you in the future or not, but listening to this conversation and seeing what we've seen, particularly in recent times, and questions of culture, what is it to go to the question from Annette? Why are we seeing this, and what is it that is driving this now, and women across the political spectrum, and the demands that are being made on political culture and political change?
Look, I know a lot of, quite well-educated, politically interested people who would be probably great politicians, but they are very deterred by political parties and the kind of machinations that go on in the back rooms to get pre-selected in the first place. So I think probably Allegra is a good case in point of how you might try and bypass the machinery and get onto the platform and be to put forward your views without that. And I think perhaps maybe social media, the ability to get directly to people now through technology is perhaps making it easier for people to get into politics without necessarily having a party machinery behind you.
As always on Q&A, so many questions, so many answers and so little time. We've run the clock down. So thank you all again for joining us here. Thanks to our panel, Lavina Lee, Andrew Constance, Allegra Spender, Chris Bowen and Greg Sheridan. And thank you as well for all of your questions. And a reminder, David Spears will be with you live from Melbourne. Next week, he'll be joined by tennis champion Jelena Dokic, psychiatrist and author Mark Cross, and an audience bringing their stories and lived experience to something that we heard a little bit about tonight as well, that important conversation about anxiety and mental health. And an extra special treat for everybody, the legendary Archie Roach will perform live as well. Stay safe. Have a good night.